And at the age of 5, Maria learned a valuable lesson that sometimes the good guy doesn't make it. And I wondered how this little girl had the courage to make her way to kindergarten and try to learn those ABCs and those 1, 2, 3s when she didn't even know what post-traumatic stress disorder was. But what she did know on that very first day in that very first classroom was, I'm different. I look different, and I talk different, and I'm poor. And I can't afford those fancy designer jeans like everyone else is wearing, or those fancy shoes that all the basketball players are wearing. And as she sat in that classroom feeling ashamed and feeling different, she raised her hand. And what came out was this combination of English and Spanish, this Spanglish. And she said people laughed at her. And she said the person who laughed the loudest and the longest on that very first day was her teacher. And so at the age of 5, Maria learned a valuable lesson that it is easier to make people laugh with you than at you. It's easier to be a bully. It's easier to be a class clown. It is easier to be in on that joke. And so Maria Reyes gave up on that teacher. She gave up on that classroom. She gave up on education. And her teacher, ironically, became her father who just came home from Twin Towers jail. The same jail that both Paris Hilton and Lindsay Lohan both went to, and I guarantee they did not have the same treatment. And her father came home from Twin Towers jail with a present and a lesson for his daughter. And it wasn't a book with a big red dog or a book with green eggs and ham, and it wasn't a book where you identified Waldo. He brought home these shiny red boxing gloves. And he told Maria at the tender age of 5, life is tough. And when it knocks you down, you better get back up swinging. So at the age of 5, this little girl, Maria Reyes, learned how to swing first and to swing fast. She learned how to keep a stiff upper lip, never show her weakness in public, never cry, because if she started, she may never stop. And most importantly, Maria, don't you rat or snitch on a homeboy. So the tender age of 5, Maria went through life with her dukes up. And when the Los Angeles Police Department stormed into that tiny one-bedroom apartment again and handcuffed her daddy again and took him off to a maximum security prison, San Quentin, Maria was ready. And she went through her childhood feeling like she was this fighter, feeling that she was up against the world. And at the age of 11, when so many kids go off to middle school, to 6th grade, she looked around her neighborhood, she looked around her block, and she realized, I can make more money out on the streets in one day than my mama does with those 3 jobs combined. So just like her daddy and her granddaddy before that, at the age of 11, Maria Reyes was jumped into a gang. And now at the age of 14, she was standing in the back of my classroom with an ankle monitor, a probation officer, and a rap sheet. And it made me feel desperate. And I started thinking, I have 148 other stories. And what happens if Darius takes that cliche about living in an undeclared war? What happens the next time his back is against the wall? Which it will be. I don't want Darius reaching for that used .38 special handgun, and I don't want Maria reaching for those red boxing gloves. There has to be another way. And I started thinking about this idea of living in an undeclared war zone. And it made me think about real kids who had actually lived in real wars. And they didn't reach for their fists, they didn't reach for those boxing gloves, they didn't reach for a gun. They reached for a pen and they told their story. A little girl in a tiny little attic who would look out her window and watch her friends being let off like sheep to slaughter, and yet every day Anne Frank wrote in her diary. Or a young boy by the name of Elie Wiesel who was crammed into a cattle car, rode into Auschwitz-Birkenau, watched his entire family perish in a chimney, and yet he too wrote about it. Or this little girl in war-torn Bosnia-Herzegovina who would watch her friends every single day get picked up by snipers on their way to school. So I went to the chair of my English department and said, is there any way that I can use books written by and for and about kids who live in real wars? The Diary of Anne Frank and Night by Elie Wiesel, or this book about a little girl in Sarajevo named Zlata Filipovic. And the chair of my English department was very cynical. She'd already written off all of these kids. And she told me in no uncertain terms that my students, my 150 kids, would never read a book from cover to cover because they were too stupid. And then she went on to say they were dumb. And then she went on to say they were nothing. And it took me back to this moment in time when I remember coming home and I was crying and I told my dad, that some boys were picking on me. And he said, Erin, sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you. And standing in that teacher's lounge, I disagreed with my dad. And I thought, what happens when we tell kids again and again and again that they're dumb or stupid or nothing? What happens if they believe it? And I walked back in my classroom and I looked at all of these beautiful faces and I realized they'd been called dumb and stupid and nothing so much and so often by so many people. They did believe it. And it was this albatross around their neck, this horrible self-fulfilling prophecy. And so without really thinking it through, I got in my car and I drove to a bookstore. And I ordered 150 copies of The Diary of Anne Frank and 150 copies of Night by Elie Wiesel and 150 copies about this little girl in Sarajevo. And I stood at that cash register realizing, oh my God, I've just used up all of my Christmas money. I've just maxed out all of my credit cards, and I'm going to be paying these books off for the next 5 years like a student loan. How can I actually convince kids who have never read a book to find themselves, to not go rent the movie, to not go get the Cliff Notes, to not go on the internet and download somebody else's paper, but to pick up a book and to find themselves somewhere within the pages? So I decided that we were going to have this toast for change. And maybe starting right then and right now, it didn't matter that Maria had been kicked out of every school she ever attended. And maybe it didn't matter that Darius had a 0.5 GPA. Starting right then, right now, we could wipe the slate clean. It would be this do-over. So I took a cue from a friend of mine who is a kindergarten teacher because I'm convinced kindergarten teachers are just fun. And I know there's a lot of you in the audience. And I have this vision that when kindergarten teachers walk, flowers magically sprout at your feet. And your bulletin board is much more sexy than my bulletin board because you all have great handwriting. So I took a cue from my friend. I blew up some balloons. I made some corny signs. I went out these plastic champagne glasses and sparkling apple cider. And in my mind, my students were going to walk into my classroom and pick up this plastic champagne glass, and they were going to toast to that number 2 pencil or that perfect 5-paragraph essay or writing that perfect book report. Because I had been brainwashed, like so many teachers, to teach to a test. And when Maria Reyes walked into my classroom and she saw my silly signs and my balloons, she taught me the most valuable lesson. Don't teach to a test. Teach to me. Because when she picked up that plastic champagne glass, it had nothing to do with that number 2 pencil or that test or that score. Because Maria is more than a number. She's more than a statistic. She is more than data. And she picked up that plastic champagne glass. At the age of 14, she got so serious. And she simply said, I don't want to be pregnant by the time I turn 15 like my mama. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life behind bars like my daddy. And I don't want to be 6 feet under by the time I turn 18 like my cousin. I want to change. And in that moment of her saying, I want to change, I realized that this tough little girl, she wasn't so tough after all. And in a moment of her weakness, in a moment of being exposed in front of a room full of her so-called enemies, it gave every other kid this opportunity to stand up and to talk about change. Darius stood up. Darius stood up and he said, I'm tired of being told to act like a man, and there is no man in my house to show me or to guide me. And then Henry stood up. And he said, I'm tired of sitting on the edge of my bed on this Christmas or this birthday waiting for my deadbeat dad to show up and bring me a present or tell me he loves me, and he never shows up. And each kid stood up, and they were tired of being poor. They were tired of being picked on. They were tired of being depressed. They were tired of having those crazy suicidal thoughts. They were tired of being bullied. And as each and every kid stood up and talked about change, there was a part of me that panicked. And I thought, oh my God, I am not a counselor. I am not a therapist. I don't even know how to work the copy machine yet. How am I supposed to help these kids change? And if I can't, maybe Anne Frank can.